Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Hello everybody, welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading. Today we shall be analyzing the Hindu newspaper dated 2nd of September 2021 of the New Delhi edition. The topics to be discussed today have been presented on the screen. Timestamping for the same has been provided in the description box below. Let us begin our today's discussion. The first article in today's newspaper appears on page number 7. The article is titled as Gouging the Household Income, Key for the Microfinance Clients. This article shall be important from the perspective of GS Paper 3 Indian Economy, particularly under the subsection of Inclusive Growth and Development. This article shall also be important from the perspective of the essay paper. See, recently the Reserve Bank of India has published a consultative document on the microfinance sector. In its consultative document, the Reserve Bank of India has identified various challenges in the microfinance sector, and accordingly it has highlighted as to how these challenges can be addressed. So as far as the importance for the UPSC examination is concerned, from the perspective of the prelims examination, one should be aware as to what exactly is the microfinance sector and what kind of services are provided by the microfinance sector. And as you can see here, in prelims 2011, there was a direct question related to the microfinance sector. And as far as the mains examination is concerned, one should be aware about the opportunities, challenges and the strategies to boost the microfinance sector. So based upon our discussion, a mains question for your practice here could be, what do you think are the major challenges faced by the microfinance sector in achieving the national priorities such as the financial inclusion and poverty eradication? Also suggest measures to address these challenges. Once we are done with the discussion of this particular topic, you should be in a position to attend these 3 prelims questions for the practice. So let us start off our discussion with respect to the financial inclusion in India. According to the Raghuram Rajan Committee, financial inclusion means that people should have access to a wide range of financial services at an affordable cost. When we say financial services, it is not just limited only to the bank account. Apart from having access to bank account, people should also have access to the cheaper loans, ability to save money, insurance, funds transfer, etc. So when people have access to these kinds of financial services, automatically people's dependence on the money lenders who usually give loans at a high rates of interest would reduce. So as people have access to these kind of financial services, automatically people's savings as well as investment would increase. Now for example, if farmers are able to have access to these kind of financial services, automatically farmers would be able to meet their credit needs both for growing of crops as well as harvesting of crops. Similarly, if the self-employed people are able to have access to these kind of financial services, the self-employed people such as the shopkeepers, tea vendors, the fruit vendors, etc., automatically these self-employed people would be able to meet their working capital requirements. So automatically, as the savings as well as investment in an economy increases, this in turn leads to the improvement in the overall productive capacity of the economy. As the productive capacity increases, the overall income level of the households would increase, and now the households would be less vulnerable to various kinds of economic shocks. That is why the financial inclusion is considered to be a key enabler for promoting and fostering the inclusive growth and development. So as you can see, there is a direct correlation between the financial inclusion and sustainable development goals. Financial inclusion would help us meet at least around 7 sustainable development goals such as eradication of poverty, ending of hunger, promoting the health and well-being, achieving the gender equality, promotion of economic growth and jobs, supporting the industry, and most importantly, it will help us reduce the income inequality and thus promote the inclusive growth and development. But unfortunately, in case of India, the financial inclusion is quite poor. For example, according to 2011 census, only 58% of the households have access to the bank accounts. Similarly, the credit rating agency known as CRISIL it publishes an index known as Inclusex to measure the extent of financial inclusion. The financial inclusion as per the CRISIL can be measured on a score of 0 to 100, where 0 would mean complete financial exclusion, whereas 100 would mean universal financial inclusion. In the year 2016, our score was 58. Similarly, recently, the Reserve Bank of India has published the Financial Inclusion Index. This index henceforth would be published every year in the month of July. The Financial Inclusion Index measures the extent of financial inclusion based upon basically three parameters, that is, access to financial services, the usage of financial services, and the quality of financial services. When we say access, it basically measures as to whether the people are able to have access to these financial services. When we say usage, it measures as to whether the people are able to use these financial services on a regular basis. And when we say quality of financial services, it basically measures the extent of financial literacy in India. It measures the extent of consumer protection that we are able to give in the financial sector, and so on. So, as per the latest score, the score in the month of March 2021, this was 54. So just like CRISIL, the RBI measures the extent of financial inclusion on a score of 0 to 100. And in the month of March 2021, our score was 54. So this clearly shows that still there is a long way to go with respect to promotion of financial inclusion in India. Please do let us know in the comments section as to what all steps have been taken by the government in order to promote the financial inclusion in India. So coming now to the need for the microfinance sector and how it will help us meet our goal of financial inclusion. See, there are different sections or categories of people in India who are not having access to financial services. These people include the BPL population, who constitute 22% of India's population, the informal workers who constitute 90% of the workers in India. These people include the farmers, agriculture workers, self-employed people, urban migrants, as well as women-led self-help groups. Now, question is, why are these categories of people not having access to financial services? First and foremost, the income levels of these people is quite lower. Secondly, these people do not have assets which can be used as a collateral in order to take loans from the banks. And thirdly, the income of these people, it's not steady, it is not fixed. The income is quite erratic or seasonal, which in turn makes it difficult for them to repay the loans on time. Now, for example, the farmers, they do not earn income throughout the year. The farmers normally earn income only upon the harvesting of the crops. Similarly, let's say there is a self-employed worker, for example, a person who is selling the flowers. Now, his income is not fixed. His income is erratic or seasonal. For example, his income level may peak during the festival season when the demand for flowers is higher, and during the other part of the year, his income could be lower. So for these categories of people, since their income is erratic or seasonal, this makes it difficult for them to repay the loans on time. Ideally, we need to give the flexibility to the people to make the repayment of loans according to their cash flows. So as and when these people want to repay the loans, that kind of flexibility should be given to them. So on account of these reasons, certain section of India's population are not having access to the financial services. That is where the microfinance sector comes into picture and help us meet our goal of financial inclusion. The microfinance sector provides for various financial services such as bank accounts, cheaper loans, savings, insurance, funds transfer, etc. to these categories of people. So when these financial services are provided, the constraints faced by the people are kept in mind. So when we say the microfinance sector includes the different categories of financial institutions and banks such as the scheduled commercial banks, RRBs, cooperative banks, small finance banks, a separate category of NBFCs known as the NBFC microfinance institutions, some of the trusts as well as societies, etc. So if you look at the characteristics of the microfinance loans, these characteristics have been formulated depending upon the constraints faced by these sections of the population. For example, the microfinance loans are given to the low income households whose annual income is below a certain threshold. The loans are given without any kind of collateral. The loans are of short duration. The loans are given mainly for the income generating activities, and more importantly, as discussed before, these loans are given with certain amount of flexibility for the repayment. So people can repay the loans on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis, as per their cash flows. So as you can see, the microfinance sector would help us achieve various national priorities such as the financial inclusion, poverty eradication, women empowerment, especially through the self-help group bank linkage through the microfinance sector, collateral-free loans, higher income levels of the people, and more importantly, it will help us build the social capital in order to promote the development. So when we say social capital comes into picture when people come together, pool in their resources, achieve a necessary amount of coordination in order to foster the economic growth and development. The best example of such a social capital happens to be the self-help group, wherein a group of women come together, pool in their money. They also get access to loans from the banks, and using that money, they can involve themselves in certain income generating activities. So the microfinance sector is considered to be a key enabler for promoting women empowerment as well as for building the social capital. So as discussed, the microfinance sector includes all of these categories of banks and financial institutions. See, the Reserve Bank of India has come up with a detailed guidelines on the microfinance sector. But please do understand that these guidelines as of now, they are applicable only to the NBFC microfinance institutions. The RBI guidelines as of now, it is not applicable to the other categories of banks and financial institutions. So let us try to understand as to what are the RBI's guidelines with respect to the microfinance sector for the NBFC microfinance institutions. What are the problems in these guidelines and how RBI has sought to address these problems. Understanding of all of these aspects would help us write an answer to this particular mains question for the practice, wherein we'll understand the challenges and how these challenges can be addressed. So let's understand first the RBI's guidelines for the microfinance institutions, that is the NBFC MFIs. According to the Reserve Bank of India, a NBFC microfinance institution is required to fulfill two important criteria. The first criteria here is it should have a net owned funds of rupees 5 crores, and if it is registered in the northeastern part of India, it should have a net owned fund of rupees 2 crores. Second criteria here is at least 85% of the loans that it gives, it should be the nature of the qualifying asset. What this means is, let's say a particular NBFC MFI has given 100 rupees worth loans. Out of these 100 rupees worth loans, at least 85 rupees worth loan should be in the nature of a qualifying asset. Now, what exactly is a qualifying asset? First and foremost, it should be a loan which should be given to the households whose annual income is below a certain threshold. In case of rural area, the income level should be below rupees 1.25 lakhs, whereas in case of urban and semi-urban areas, the annual income should be below rupees 2 lakhs. The maximum loan amount should not exceed rupees 1.25 lakh per borrower. Nextly, collateral is not needed for giving of such loans, and as far as the repayment schedule is concerned, the persons or the households can make the repayment on a weekly basis, fortnightly basis, or on a monthly basis as per their own choice. So these are the guidelines which the RBI has laid down for the microfinance sector. But these guidelines as of now, they're applicable only to the NBFC microfinance institutions. They're not applicable to the other categories of banks which also give the microfinance loans. It is not applicable to scheduled commercial banks, RRBs, cooperative banks, small finance banks, and so on. So that is where RBI has highlighted certain problems in the present framework and how these problems can be addressed by adopting certain strategies. The first one is with respect to applicability of the RBI's guidelines. So as highlighted before, presently the RBI's guidelines is applicable only to the NBFC microfinance institutions. So even though the scheduled commercial banks, RRBs, cooperative banks, etc. also give the microfinance loans, RBI's guidelines is not applicable to them. So RBI has highlighted that whatever guidelines are now applicable to the NBFC microfinance institutions, the same guidelines should be extended even to the other categories of banks which are involved in giving off the microfinance loans. The second problem is with respect to definition of the microfinance loan. See, we discuss as to what constitutes a microfinance loan according to the Reserve Bank of India. It should be a loan given to a household whose annual income is below a certain threshold. Its maximum value should not be above rupees 1.25 lakh. No collateral should be taken, and there should be flexibility in the repayment of schedule. So right now, this definition is applicable only to the NBFC microfinance institutions. The definition of microfinance loan as of now, it is not applicable to the other categories of banks. So there is a need to have a common definition of what constitutes a microfinance loan. So whatever is the present definition of microfinance loan for the NBFC microfinance institution, the same definition should be extended even to the other categories of banks as well. The third problem is that of the indebtedness or the overborrowing. See, according to RBI's guidelines, a single person, he cannot borrow money from more than 2 NBFC MFIs. So let's say a particular person has borrowed money from NBFC MFI A and NBFC MFI B simultaneously. So when he has already borrowed from 2 NBFCs simultaneously, he cannot borrow money from the third NBFC, let's say in this particular case C. Now such a restriction has been laid down by the RBI in order to ensure that this particular person does not end up overborrowing from different financial institutions. If a person overborrows the money, most of his income would be spent in repaying the principal amount as well as the interest amount, and this would have an adverse impact on his overall savings. Secondly, if this particular person overborrows the money beyond his repaying capacity, automatically he will not be able to repay the loans on time. This will lead to increase in NPS, and thus it will have an adverse impact on the financial position of the NBFCs. So overall, RBI has laid down this particular guideline to ensure that the person does not overborrow the money. A person borrows money only within his repaying capacity. But the problem here is this particular RBI's guideline is applicable only to the NBFC microfinance institutions, which means in this particular case, let's say a particular person, he has already borrowed money from NBFC A and NBFC B. Right now, he cannot borrow money from another NBFC C, but this person, he can borrow money from the scheduled commercial bank, he can borrow money from the regional rural bank, he can also borrow money from the small finance bank as well as the cooperative banks. So right now, this person as such, he can borrow money from the other categories of banks. So once again, this can lead to the overborrowing. And as discussed before, if he ends up overborrowing beyond his repaying capacity, this will not only adversely affect his own personal finances, it will also adversely affect the financial position of the banks. Accordingly, in order to solve this particular problem of overborrowing, RBI has proposed a strategy. Here, RBI has highlighted that presently there is a limit on how much money the households could borrow. And this limit as of now is rupees 1.25 lakh per borrower. Now this limit of 1.25 lakh per borrower, that is uniform irrespective of the income level of the households. So whether the household's income is say rupees 50,000 or whether it is 1.25 lakh, both these two categories of households will be able to avail loans of up to rupees 1.25 lakhs. So the RBI has highlighted that instead of having a uniform limit on the loan amount of rupees 1.25 lakh per borrower, we need to have a loan limit which is in turn based upon the household income. Now, as to how much should be the limit on the loan which can be availed by the particular household, according to RBI, this should be 50% of the income. Now, it means that if a particular household has an annual income of rupees 1 lakh, it should be able to avail loan of only up to rupees 50,000. Similarly, in case of urban area, if a particular household has an annual income of rupees 2 lakh, then such a urban household should be able to avail loans of up to rupees 1 lakh. So the limit on the loan, it should be 50% of the income of the households. So right now, whatever limit we have fixed, that is uniform across all the households, that is irrespective of their annual incomes. So going forward, we need to fix a limit, and that limit should depend upon the income levels of the households, and that should be 50% of the income levels. The next problem is with respect to the interest rate on the microfinance loans. Presently, the Reserve Bank of India has fixed the ceiling rate or the maximum interest rates which can be charged by the NBFC microfinance institutions while giving the microfinance loans. This maximum interest rate is to be calculated based upon a formula which has been given by the Reserve Bank of India. As far as the UPSC examination is concerned, there is no need for you to know the formula. But what you are required to know here is that the RBI has fixed the maximum interest rate that is to be charged by the NBFC microfinance institutions. Now let's say according to this particular formula, the maximum interest rate comes to be at 8%. So a particular NBFC microfinance institution cannot give the microfinance loans above this particular rate of interest. Now the RBI feels that the fixing of the maximum interest rate has led to an adverse impact in the microfinance sector. Let's understand how. See, ideally, when banks are giving loans, they charge different rates of interest. Now the rate of interest which is charged by the bank in turn depends upon various important aspects. It depends upon its operating cost. It depends upon how much of deposit it has. It depends upon the rate of interest it is offering on its deposits and so on. So if a particular bank has lower operating cost, if it has higher amount of deposits, if it is offering lower rate of interest on the deposits, automatically it will be able to offer a low rate of interest on the loans. Similarly, if a particular bank has high operating cost, a low deposit base and a high rate of interest on the deposits, then automatically a bank will be charging a higher rate of interest on the loans. So ideally, the rate of interest on the loans is in turn dependent upon certain important parameters. So what is happening here is, so when the RBI is fixing the maximum interest rates on the loans which can be charged by the NBFC microfinance institutions, all the NBFC microfinance institutions are giving the microfinance loans at almost around the ceiling rate of 8%. A particular NBFC may be in a position to offer loans at a lower rate of interest because of its lower operating cost, higher deposit base, low rate of interest on the deposits and so on. In spite of that, it is still sticking to the maximum ceiling limit or the maximum interest rate which the RBI has fixed. So a particular large size NBFC MFI may be in a position to offer loans on the microfinance sector at say 6% rate of interest. But right now it is offering the microfinance loans at almost around the ceiling rate of 8%. So this in a way has hindered the competition among the NBFC's microfinance institutions. That is the first problem. The second problem here is the interest rate which the RBI has fixed, that is the maximum interest rate, that right now is applicable only to the NBFC's MFIs which give approximately around 30% of the microfinance loans. The remaining 70% of the microfinance loans are given by the scheduled commercial banks, RRBs, etc. And for these categories of banks, the maximum interest rate or the ceiling rate is not applicable. So these categories of banks as such, they may be in a position to offer a low rate of interest of say around 4 to 5%. But since there is a ceiling on the rate of interest which is charged by the NBFC MFIs, once again, the scheduled commercial banks, RRBs, etc. are giving loans to the microfinance sector at almost around the ceiling rate of interest of 8%. So even though there is no ceiling or the maximum interest rate on different categories of banks such as the scheduled commercial banks, RRBs, etc., these banks end up giving loans at almost around 8%, which is the ceiling rate of interest for the NBFC microfinance institutions. So overall, the RBI feels that the maximum interest rate or the ceiling rate on the microfinance loans has in turn hindered the competition. By doing away with the ceiling rate, each of the banks, each of the financial institution will be able to offer different rates of interest depending upon their own parameters such as the operating cost, deposit base, the rate of interest on the deposits, and so on. So some banks will be able to offer low rates of interest on the microfinance loans because of their lower operating cost, high deposit base, etc. So by doing away with the maximum interest rates on the microfinance loans, we would be able to promote competition among different banks. Different banks will try to bring down the rate of interest in order to cater to the microfinance sector. Accordingly, the RBI has suggested that the interest rates on the microfinance loans, it should be left to the discretion of the individual banks. But at the same time, necessary safeguards would have to be inbuilt in order to ensure that the NBFC, MFIs and different categories of banks do not charge a very high rate of interest. The last aspect is with respect to collateral-free loans. See, presently, as per the RBI's guidelines, the concept of collateral-free loans has been made applicable only to the NBFC microfinance institutions. As far as the other categories of banks is concerned, it has been left to their own discretion whether they want to accept the collateral or not while giving the microfinance loans. RBI has now highlighted that the concept of collateral-free loans in the microfinance sector, it should be made applicable to the other categories of banks as well. So these are some of the problems in the microfinance sector, and these are the strategies which have been highlighted by the Reserve Bank of India. So these are some of the important aspects which one should know with respect to this particular article. As far as the prelims MCQ number 1 as well as prelims MCQ number 3 is concerned, I hope you'll be able to answer these questions on your own. Please do let us know the answer in the comments section. As far as the prelims MCQ number 2 is concerned, the question here is, with respect to on-lending to the priority sector, consider the following statements. See, according to the Reserve Bank of India, on-lending basically means that the banks can give certain amount of loans to the NBFCs, microfinance institutions, etc., which then should forward the loans to the sectors which have been categorized as a priority sectors. So they can give loans to different sectors such as education, housing, renewable energy, MSME, etc. So whatever loans the banks are giving to the NBFCs as well as microfinance institutions, which in turn should be given to the priority sectors, that concept we call it as a concept of on-lending. So through the on-lending, banks can be able to meet their priority sector lending requirements. Earlier, this facility of on-lending to the priority sector was applicable only to the scheduled commercial banks. It was not applicable to the cooperative banks, regional rural banks, small finance banks, and so on. Now, recently, the Reserve Bank of India has enabled even the small finance banks for the on-lending. So the small finance banks can give certain amount of loans to NBFCs and microfinance institutions in order to meet their priority sector lending requirements. So as of now, this facility of on-lending is applicable only to the scheduled commercial banks and the small finance banks. As of now, it is not applicable to the cooperative banks and the regional rural banks. So the statement number 2 which is given here is wrong, whereas the statement number 1 which is given here is right. Accordingly, the right answer to this particular question would be A, that is 1 only. With this, we have come to the end of this particular article discussion. Let us now move on to the next article. The next article appears on page number 14. The article is titled as State Bank of India to raise 4,000 crore worth money through the issuance of the additional Tier 1 bonds. This article shall be important from the perspective of prelims under the subsection of Indian economy. See, last year in the month of March 2020, the overall financial position of Yes Bank had deteriorated significantly. Prior to this, the Yes Bank had raised approximately around 8,000 crore worth money through the issuance of the additional Tier 1 bonds. So when its financial position deteriorated in the month of March 2020, RBI then asked the Yes Bank not to repay the investors of its additional Tier 1 bonds. So whoever had invested in the additional Tier 1 bonds issued by Yes Bank did not get back their money. So since this particular topic of additional Tier 1 bonds has been in news in the last 1 to 1.5 years, this becomes quite important for your prelims examination. From the perspective of the prelims examination, you should be basically be aware about the rationale and features of the additional tier 1 bonds. More importantly, as you can see in prelims 2016, there was a question related to the IFC masala bonds, which was in news in that particular year. Similarly, in prelims 2015, there was a question related to Basel III norms, which is closely related to the additional tier 1 bonds. So once we discuss about the features of the additional tier 1 bonds, you should be in a position to attempt this particular prelims questions for the practice. See, recently in our DNS dated 2nd of July 2021, I have discussed in much greater detail the concept of the capital adequacy ratio and the Basel III norms. So in case if any of you have not gone through this particular DNS, I suggest you to go through this particular DNS in order to understand all the aspects related to the Basel III norms. See, in this particular DNS, I had highlighted that the banks in case of India are required to maintain a capital of 11.5% of the risk-weighted assets in order to meet the Basel III norms. Out of this 11.5% of the capital, the tier 1 capital should be 7%, tier 2 capital should be 2%, and the capital conservation buffer should be 2.5%. When we look at the minimum tier 1 capital, this 7% can be in turn broken down into the common equity tier 1 capital of 5.5% and additional tier 1 capital of 1.5%. So this common equity tier capital of 5.5% can be met by the banks through the issuance of shares. Similarly, the tier 2 capital of 2% can be met by the banks by issuing the bonds. When it comes to the additional tier 1 capital of 1.5% of the risk-weighted assets, this capital can be met by the banks through the issuance of a very specific type of bonds known as the additional tier 1 bonds. So these additional tier 1 bonds are basically issued by the banks in order to meet their additional tier 1 capital requirements as laid down under the Basel III norms. Now the characteristics of these additional tier 1 bonds are in a way much different from the normal bonds issued by the companies. So let's understand as to in what way the additional tier 1 bonds are different from the normal bonds. The first difference is with respect to the purpose for which the bonds are issued. So if you look at the normal bonds are issued by the companies as well as banks in order to raise capital to meet their investment requirements. But the additional tier 1 bonds, they are very specific bonds. Specific bonds which are issued by the banks in order to meet their additional tier 1 capital requirements under the Basel III norms. That is the first difference. Secondly, if you look at the normal bonds, in case of normal bonds, we would have a face value, which denotes how much money a company is borrowing, the rate of interest, and the maturity period. But in case of the additional tier 1 bonds, we would have only the face value and the rate of interest. There would be no maturity period. That is why these bonds are also referred to as a perpetual bonds. So it means that you as an investor, if you buy an additional tier 1 bond of a particular bank, then you would not be sure as to when you would get back your money. The bank can pay you money just after 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years or 15 years. It is completely up to the bank as to when it would want to pay back the investors of the additional tier 1 bonds. See, the normal bonds are considered to be secured because they are backed by collateral. But the additional tier 1 bonds, they are unsecured because they are not backed by any kind of collateral. So because of its unsecured nature, there is higher amount of risk involved in investing in additional tier 1 bonds. So because of the higher risk, the rate of interest on the additional tier 1 bonds would be normally higher in comparison to the rate of interest on the normal bonds. Nextly, see, when you invest in a normal bond, you are entitled to get the regular interest. You may get interest either on a semi-annual basis, that is half-yearly basis, or on an annual basis. But in case of the additional tier 1 bonds, if the overall financial position of the banks becomes weak, the banks can even skip the interest payments. So in some of the years, the investors of the additional tier 1 bonds may not get the interest. As to when a particular bank can skip the interest payment, the Reserve Bank of India has come up with a detailed guidelines. So according to these guidelines, if the overall financial position of the banks is poor, then the banks can skip the interest payments. As to what are these guidelines, these are not actually important from the perspective of the UPSC prelims examination. What is important is in some of the years, the banks can skip the interest payment on the additional tier 1 bonds, particularly when their financial position is poor. As far as the redemption by the banks is concerned, in case of the normal bonds, the investors would get back their money, that is the principal amount, upon the maturity period. But in case of the additional tier 1 bonds, since there is no maturity period, the investors may get back the money either after 1 year, 3 years, 5 years or 10 years, and that is to be decided by the banks themselves. But till the time the banks continue to hold on to the additional tier 1 bonds, the banks would have to pay the interest to its investors. And lastly, upon the maturity period, the investors in case of the normal bonds can ask for the return of money. But in case of the additional tier 1 bonds, the investors cannot ask for the return of money. It is completely up to the banks as to when it would want to return back the money to the investors. More importantly, in some of the cases, the banks can even cancel the repayment on the additional tier 1 bonds. See, the Reserve Bank of India in its guidelines has laid on an event which is known as the point of non-viability event. It basically means that if a bank reaches the point of non-viability event, its overall financial position is extremely poor. So because its financial position is poor, the bank would not be in a position to return the money to the investors of the additional tier 1 bonds. So if a bank reaches a point of non-viability event, the banks can simply refuse to make the repayment on the additional tier 1 bonds. This had happened with the S Bank. So S Bank, because of its poor financial position, it had reached the point of non-viability, because of which the Reserve Bank of India had called upon the S Bank to cancel its repayment obligation on the additional tier 1 bonds. So obviously, from this particular discussion of ours, you must have understood that the investment in additional tier 1 bonds is extremely risky. In some of the years, you may not get the interest, and after certain years, the bank can skip the principal payment also because of the point of non-viability event. In spite of so many risks, why do investors still invest in the additional tier 1 bonds? See, one basic reason, as I highlighted before, is since they are riskier, the rate of interest on the additional tier 1 bonds is much higher in comparison to the normal bonds. So certain risk-taking investors who would want to make higher profits on their investment would buy these additional tier 1 bonds. So as far as the prelims examination is concerned, if you are aware about these basic aspects, that alone should be sufficient. So based upon our discussion, please try to find out the answer to this particular prelims MCQ number 4 and let us know the answer in the comment section given below. With this, let us now take up the next article. The next article appears on page number 1. Now this particular article is with respect to the GST collections for the month of August 2021. According to the government's report, the GST collections for the month of August 2021 have increased by 30% in comparison to the GST collections in the month of August 2020. So year on year GST collections have increased by 30%. But when we compare the GST collections in the month of August 2021 with the GST collections in the previous month of July 2021, there has been decline in the GST collection. Now this particular decline in the GST collection for the month of August 2021 is quite significant. This is so because the overall GST collection tells us the prevailing demand in the economy. See, as the demand in the economy increases, people would buy more of goods and services. So as people buy more of goods and services, this would not only lead to increase in the GST revenue collection, this would also lead to the increase in the consumption expenditure in the Indian economy. So the very fact that the GST collections has got reduced in the month of August 2021 not only means that the GST revenue has got reduced, even the consumption expenditure has also got reduced. Now this becomes important because the consumption expenditure, it is considered to be the major driver of Indian economy. It contributes almost around 60% to India's GDP. So unless the consumption expenditure revives, the Indian economy would not be able to come out of the present economic slowdown. So this particular article specifically talks about the GST collection for a particular month. So overall, this article is not important. But overall, from the perspective of the prelims examination, one should be aware about the general trends in the GST collection, the GST council, and the recent controversy over the GST compensation cess. As far as the mains examination is concerned, one should be aware about the critical analysis of the GST regime. That is, what are the benefits and challenges with respect to the GST regime. Now, these aspects become important because, as you can see repeatedly in previous year prelims as well as previous year mains, questions have been asked with respect to various aspects of the GST regime. Accordingly, all of these aspects which become important both from the perspective of prelims as well as mains have been covered in our DNS dated the 1st of May 2021. As you can see in this particular article, I have discussed about the important aspects of GST from the perspective of the prelims examination. I have also carried out a critical analysis of GST wherein I have discussed the problems and challenges in the GST regime. So in case any of you have not gone through this particular DNS dated 1st of May 2021, I suggest you to go through this particular article to understand all the aspects related to GST which could be asked in the prelims and the mains examination. The next article appears on page number 4. The article is titled as Ladakh adopts a state animal and state bird. This particular article highlights that Ladakh has adopted snow leopard as a state animal and black-necked crane as a state bird. In this regard, let us look into some important details about the snow leopard from the perspective of the UPSC prelims examination. See, the snow leopard is basically found in various countries such as Afghanistan, Bhutan, China, India, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and so on. In case of India, it is found in Jammu and Kashmir, Ladakh, Himachal Pradesh, Uttarakhand, Arunachal Pradesh, and Sikkim. As far as its protection status is concerned, it has been placed under the IUCN Red List and it has been placed under the vulnerable category. This is so because its global population is less than 10,000. As far as its protection status under the Wildlife Protection Act is concerned, it has been placed under the Schedule 1 of the Wildlife Protection Act, which offers it the highest level of protection. As far as the conservation efforts is concerned, in case of India, we have launched a project Snow Leopard in the year 2009. And as far as the global level is concerned, almost around 13 countries across the world, including India, they have launched the Snow Leopard Ecosystem Protection Program. These countries have signed a declaration known as the Bishkek Declaration. As part of this particular declaration, these countries have committed to secure at least around 20 snow leopard landscapes by the end of 2020. This initiative is also referred to as Secure 20 by 2020. So these are some of the important aspects which you should know with respect to snow leopard. The next article appears on page number 4. The article is titled as Meghalaya scraps the power project post the protest. Earlier, the Meghalaya government had decided to construct a hydroelectric power project across the Umngot river. But because of the protest by the people, the Meghalaya government has finally decided to scrap this particular hydroelectric power project. So from the perspective of the prelims examination, let us look into some important aspects of the Umngot river. See, the Umngot river flows to the state of Meghalaya. In particular, it flows to a place known as Doki, which is located in the East Jaintia district of Meghalaya near the Indo-Bangladesh border. This river forms a natural boundary between Jaintia and Khasi hills in Meghalaya. One of the most unique aspects of this particular river is that this river, it is considered to the cleanest river in India. As you can see in this particular picture, the water of this river is so crystal clear that in some of the places you can actually see the river bed. So because of this, the Umngot river, it is considered to be a major tourist attraction in Doki. So when the Meghalaya government proposed to set up a hydroelectric power project across the Umngot river, people feared that it would lead to loss of livelihood opportunities, particularly tourism, plus the construction of dam would also lead to their displacement, because of which there was huge protest against this particular hydroelectric project. And finally, the government of Meghalaya has decided to scrap this project. So from the perspective of the prelims examination, please make a note of the important aspects of the Umngot river. Next on page number 8, we have an article which is titled as 200 Army Personnel for the Zapad exercise. This particular article highlights that a multinational military exercise, to be more specific, the Army exercise known as the Zapad exercise, is to be held in Russia from September 3 to September 16. The basic objective of this multinational military exercise is to enhance the military and strategic ties among the participating countries and to boost the anti-terror cooperation. Russia has so far invited 17 countries. Some countries are participating countries while some countries are the observer countries. India is one of the participating countries, whereas countries such as China and Pakistan, they are the observer countries. So this is what you have to know with respect to the Zapad exercise. The next article appears on page number 7. The article is titled as India must commit to the net zero emissions. This particular article basically discusses as to what should be the India's stand with respect to climate change negotiations. See, almost a similar article had appeared in the Hindu newspaper dated 7th of April 2021. The title of the article was Reworking the Net Zero for the Climate Justice. So in this particular DNS dated 7th of April 2021, Vaibhav sir has covered all the aspects related to the climate change negotiations. He has covered the key points of the Paris climate change deal, the current challenges in the climate change negotiations, and what should be the India's stand with respect to climate change negotiations. So in order to understand this particular article which has appeared in today's newspaper, I suggest you to go to the DNS dated 7th of April 2021. The link to this particular DNS video has been given in the description box below. With this, we have come to the end of today's discussion. Now the answer to the question that was asked in yesterday's DNS is option D.